So you want to start your own supply chain. There are a couple things to consider when looking at starting your own supply chain. You need to decide on the extent of integration, the logistics, the use of technology, and the characteristics you're looking for in a supplier. So let's look first at the extent of integration. So really we're looking at will you have vertical integration? That is, will you own your supplier or a distributor? So when we look at the parts of the supply chain, which we looked at in a previous slide, so let's just go back here, supplier, manufacturer, distributor, retailer. Will you own multiple parts of that supply chain? So maybe you are the manufacturer, will you also be the distributor? Or if you're the manufacturer, will you also make some of the components or supplies that go in it? So that is vertical integration, where you own multiple parts of the supply chain. So as we consider whether or not we have vertical integration, we need to look at the benefits and the risks associated with that. So some of the benefits of vertical integration is that we can reduce that bullwhip effect. We can reduce our lead times, have better communication. We don't have to worry so much about the supplier constantly changing prices, creating that big swing in the amount of orders, and that cause that huge variability and reduced utilization. So other reasons we would have vertical integration is to have more efficiency. We can focus on improving quality throughout the process. We can share proprietary information because all of the parts of the supply chain are our own company. So there's a number of reasons why you might have vertical integration. A reason why you might not have vertical integration, why it's better to have separate companies be part of your supply chain, is you may not have the expertise. So as we're looking at should we have vertical integration, there's a great article from McKinsey. So McKinsey is an international business consulting company, often comes in and helps companies streamline, become more efficient in terms of their operations. They also look at marketing as well. So we have an article here, when and when not to vertically integrate. And so that says here that vertical integration is a risky strategy, complex, expensive, hard to reverse, yet some companies jump in without adequate analysis of the risks. So I do just want to point you to a couple components of this article. You can read it in more detail, but some of the things to consider as you're looking at whether or not you should own more of your components of your supply chain. So you have to consider the costs in terms of capital, training, and expertise. We also have to look at the level of information sharing and the legal components as we consider whether or not to purchase the other parts of our supply chain. Can we share information with the companies that are part of our supply chain, or do we need to keep that in-house? We also need to look at whether or not owning the other parts of the supply chain will protect us from the market. So maybe by taking over other parts of the supply chain, we're able to adopt new technologies that the company we're purchasing has. Will it increase our capacity utilization? Will we be able to reduce lead time and delivery performance? Will it allow us to improve quality? So of course, when we have a well-managed supply chain, we want to focus on improving efficiency and effectiveness. Once you've done that to the extent that you can, when your relationship with your companies, sometimes you can take that further by owning the company. On the other hand, though, if you have if you don't have the expertise, so it's going to cost you a lot in terms of setup, or there's a lot of risks with having that ownership of the other parts of the supply chain, then that might be a reason not to. So why would you vertically integrate? Well, if your supplier or your distributor has a lot of market power, then you may want them to be part of your own company just to help improve your own market power. You can also, as you own the other parts of the supply chain, you can you would do that if it increases barriers to entry. So we're looking for economies of scale, and we're looking for, can we put an investment into typically infrastructure or some fixed costs, and then that allows us to produce more and get the per unit cost down, and that keeps out other competitors from the market because they just can't compete with that initial big fixed cost and then the prices that we're offering because we're able to spread that across so many units. When you're looking at vertical integration, according to this McKinsey report here, it says that you should integrate if your market is young or if your market is in decline. So let's just go back and look at the life cycle of a business. So in the early stages, when you are first building the company, you have low sales, high costs, and it's really these high cost pieces here where we're looking at that vertical integration. Can we reduce the costs by having ownership of more parts of the supply chain? So while the McKinsey report says you can have vertical integration in those early stages, it's not likely that you're going to have vertical integration early on when you're first building the business, just because you likely don't have the financial capital at that point. Although if you do, you could have your own business, buy the other parts of the supply chain that'll help you get into the market as well as spread out some of those costs initially. Much more likely is that you are doing vertical integration where you're in more of the decline stage. So you've grown the business as much as you can. Now you're starting to see declining sales, but the costs are still high. So now you're looking for ways to further lower costs. And so if we can find greater efficiencies, economies of scale, we can reduce some of the transport costs by owning parts of the supply chain. If we can increase the operations throughout, then that helps spread out those costs across our sales. It can also help if we take over parts of the supply chain distributors and retail in order to get into other markets and look at for more expansion. So some of the companies that have done vertical integration, so Campbell's Soup own part of their purchased basically their suppliers and doubled their inventory and turnover rates. HP was purchased some of their suppliers and that helped them cut their supply costs by 75%. Walmart owns their own distribution process and they are one of the largest and most profitable retailers. So there is a value to vertical integration, but there is a lot of risk to it. If we go back to that McKinsey report here, who is most likely to vertically integrate? So let's just go down their article here. If you have a lot of transactions, so you buy a lot or you get a lot from a supplier or you send a lot to your distributor or retailer, so there's a lot of movement of inventory, a lot of purchases, then you're more likely to have vertical integration just because there's so much cost attached to that constant ordering and shipping. The other thing to look at, according to the McKinsey report here, is the asset specificity, durability, and intensity. So what they mean here, and they highlight in this article, it's really looking at what is your switching cost? How hard is it for you to switch suppliers or distributors? And so there's a couple components they highlight here. First is site, as they look at their assets. So site, are you on a fixed location? If you're at a fixed location, then it's harder to find other distributors for you that or other suppliers for you that aren't going to increase your costs, your logistics costs, just because of the set location. You don't have the ability to move from that. So if you have a fixed location, you're more likely to have vertical integration. If you have very technical components, so specialized equipment, so if you're a supplier, you're working together, you need certain technology to interact with your suppliers, with your distributors, with retail. If it's very proprietary software and equipment, then often you will do vertical integration. It's just easier to keep that in-house than to try to find suppliers that are using or knowledgeable in that same technology that you have. And then the third one that McKinsey looks at is human capital. So if working with the distributor, with the retailers, with your suppliers requires very specialized knowledge and skills of your people, then you're more likely to have vertical integration and do it in-house than to have to look for external companies that have that level of skill and specialization. So if you have lots of transactions, if you have a high level of specificity, then those are going to make you more likely to have a vertical integration. All right, so we were deciding on the level of integration. So we could own the supply chain. That's one option. If we're not going to own the supply chain, then the next thing we have to consider is the level of information sharing. And so there's kind of 4 levels of information sharing we're going to look at here. So the first one is very basic. The idea here is that we are just, talking to each other. We're sharing information. So the idea here is to reduce the bullwhip effect and to have early problem detection. So we're talking to each other, company to company, and sharing just some basic information in terms of orders and what we're seeing in our company. So we have trust and confidence in our supplier, but we're not sharing tons of proprietary information. Really, it's just, here's how much we need and what characteristics we need in that particular product. The next level would be to coordinate workflow, productions, operations, and procurement. So the idea here is that we are now going to be ordering based on actual sales. So instead of just ordering, we tend to order 100 units every week. That's just basic information sharing. Now we're starting to work together to look at sales. We're sharing information. Often we're going to have some kind of EDI, electronic data interchange. And this is going to be software that is going to share purchase orders, sales data, invoices across the supply chain. So the idea is that we can log into the system, and if we are the supplier for a company, we can see how much the retailer is using of a particular product. So this allows for much more quick response, and we're quicker to the market with our products and more efficient. You can take that electronic data interchange to the next level to what is called ERP. Enterprise Requirement Planning. So with Enterprise Requirement Planning, we take the data that's shared with EDI and we take it to the next level by transforming it into business decisions. So how much inventory is needed? How much do we need to produce? So with ERP, what happens is now our software, computer technology is helping make decisions for parts of the supply chain. So you can see we've increased the level of information sharing from just, how much we're going to order to now the suppliers can see what's happening with our business in terms of sales and orders at a much more detailed live level, okay, because they're now in the system with our software. And if we're using ERP, then they're making decisions based on what's happening with sales and inventory at the distributor or retailer. So the next level is what is called CPFR, Collaborative Planning, Forecasting, and Replenishment. And so what we're doing here on my page here is that we are collaborating. So we're sharing data like you see in the previous one. And we are now looking at the data together. So we are sharing the information through software, but we're also collaborating and looking at that data together to establish forecasts. So what do we think is going to be happening in the future? We also are then going to work together to develop the purchase orders together. And so we're doing some of that future planning together. We also can have replenishment. So our supplier can be the one who's monitoring the level of inventory within our system and makes decisions about replenishment. So for example, the vendor managed inventory, VMI, is what grocery stores use. So when it comes to restocking like Coca-Cola on the grocery store shelves, it's not the grocery store that's restocking the Coca-Cola, it's Coca-Cola itself. And so it is the vendor, Coca-Cola, who's monitoring the level of inventory in the grocery store and is responsible for the replenishment. So again, we've now upped the level of information sharing from here. We just placed orders and had periodic conversations, to now with ERP, we are sharing an inventory management system software that's providing information across the supply chain and helping make decisions, to the next step where we're now working and coordinating together to forecast, and the suppliers can come in and do the replenishment rather than us placing the orders. So even greater level of collaboration and higher capacity utilization. There's a fourth level here, or kind of a separate one in terms of the level of information sharing. And this one has to do with expansion. So the adoption of new business models, penetration of new markets, creating new opportunities. And so this is where we're working together with companies to go into new locations. So for example, if I am a Chinese beer manufacturer and I want to sell my beer in Canada, then there's a number of legal issues in terms of that cross-border. And so I'm going to need to coordinate with retailers and distributors in Canada in order to get my product in. So now we're coordinating in terms of that future expansion and new markets. All right, so we have here essentially 4 different types of information sharing. Let's go back. So we can do vertical integration, right? We can be the entire supply chain. If not, we have to decide how much information we're going to share. Now, if we share a lot of proprietary information and our supplier then changes, the risk is they have that information as they go out and start working with our competitors. So we have to decide what level of trust and information sharing we have. We also need to look at how much coordinated activity we want to have in terms of increasing efficiencies. So are we simply sharing sales data? Are we working together to forecast for the future? Are we working together to enter new markets? So if we're going to have vertical integration within our supply chain, or we're going to have greater relationships with the members of our supply chain, we need to make a decision about where we're going to hold our inventory. Okay, so if we can move the inventory, as we move the inventory through the supply chain, let's go back to our here. Okay, so raw materials. Okay, then we have our manufacturer, and we may have parts to manufacturing, so we may have work in process. When it comes to vaccine creation, there's a number of different companies that do different parts of making the vaccine. So you might have multiple manufacturers and work in process that's moving around. Okay, if you're looking at a car, right, we have suppliers who are making some of the components like the engine, like the tires. We have an assembly system manufacturing, but there also might be a partial assembly done in different locations. We have distributors, and then on to our retailers before we get to the client. So where are you storing your inventory? Okay. Are you holding your inventory mostly as raw materials, and then as requests come in for your product, then you're manufacturing it? Do you manufacture and have a large quantity sitting with the distributor and then going out to the retailers as they need replenishment? Okay, so it really will depend on the type of company you have. When it comes to the car manufacturing, right, we have a lot sitting at the retailer. That would be like at Cam Clark Ford, sitting on the lot. If we're looking at more of like beer production, a lot of it sits with the distributor, wholesalers. That's where the inventory is stored. If you're doing more just-in-time manufacturing, then it's going to sit in terms of the raw materials with the suppliers and then move very quickly through the rest of the process. So where are you storing or holding your inventory? Gotta find my slide again. There we go. Now, the further down the supply chain you hold your inventory. So if we very quickly go back, if we're storing a lot of our inventory with the retailer, then there are some risks associated with that, as opposed to holding it much further up the supply chain. Okay, so the further down the supply chain, the inventory loses the flexibility of use. So let's think about a car production. We have the metal components with the supplier. When we get to manufacturing, we turn it into a particular vehicle. We make it a particular color. When it sits on the retail lot, it now has a date attached to it. 2019 F-150 in blue has these different features. So it loses its flexibility of use the further down the supply chain. It now has become very specific. The other thing is that now the value of the inventory is at its maximum, right? Because we've added all the value, we've added all the components to it. It's now at its most expensive. If you store your inventory earlier in the supply chain, before you've given it a color, so before we have decided that the F-150 is blue and we're storing it instead in more work in process or in supplies, if we haven't added the sunroof, the winter package, those pieces, then it can be turned into different things. It could be different colors. It could have different packages attached to it, so it's more flexible. We can turn it into a slightly different product to sell, and it is not as valuable because it doesn't have all those features and add-ons and characteristics. So there is a risk with storing your inventory further down the supply chain. You have less options of how you're going to use it, and it is now its most valuable. So if something happens, let's say there's a fire at the dealership, then that's a much bigger loss to the supply chain than if there is a fire at a warehouse that is some of the, let's say it was storing benches for the F-150's chairs, seats, right? So when at the end of the supply chain, it has a lot more value. So when we're looking at where we're storing our inventory along the supply chain, we have to consider our risk pooling. So risk pooling is where we are holding safety stock. That's the extra, the excess, the just in case, holding our safety stock in one central location. Rather than in multiple locations. So for example, what do we mean by this? What we mean is that if you are Best Buy, where you're holding your extra excess refrigerators, are they at the Red Deer Best Buy? If they're at the Red Deer Best Buy, then there's higher risk because if something happens to that Red Deer Best Buy, they're at their highest value, okay? They're at the end of the supply chain, there's less flexibility of use. But the other piece is that if they are in Red Deer, then they're going to sit and wait for a sale of that refrigerator, that particular model in Red Deer. Okay. Well, what if we are really selling a lot of those refrigerators, but not in Red Deer? So what companies will do is they will have a central location, a warehouse, a distribution center where they can risk pool, where they can hold their excess inventory. And then if there is more demand for that refrigerator in Edmonton, then as there are sales of that refrigerator, we can move the inventory to Edmonton. But instead of having it in Edmonton and having to relocate it to Red Deer if there's demand, and then having to relocate it to Calgary if there's demand, and the Red Deer one to Edmonton and the Red Deer one to Calgary, and all this moving of inventory of all these different locations, if we have a central location, then we can send out the product to where it needs to be, and then it's available for all the different locations. Rather than constantly having to move in, shuffling inventory between our different locations, we keep it at one central location. So the idea here is to reduce storage cost and to reduce obsolescence cost, because if it just keeps sitting in Red Deer because nobody in Red Deer wants that fridge, it's losing value, it's depreciating, nobody wants an old model. Okay, but if it's in that central location, we can move it to wherever there is demand. The last term we want to look at here is what is called delayed differentiation. So delayed differentiation is where we wait until late in that supply chain, late in the process, to add our differentiating features. So think about the sale of paint. Okay. How come they don't add color to the paint until you buy it? Well, what we said is that the further down the supply chain we are, the inventory loses flexibility of use. So if you think about a neon pink color of paint, there's only so many people willing to buy that. If instead we keep it as a base, and then we add the colorant based on what the customer wants, then that allows us to move that inventory and not have so much value in a particular product and have very limited use for it. So if we can delay the differentiation, wait until later in the supply chain to start adding the different colors or unique features, then that gives us much more flexibility and means that we can get that inventory out and as a finished product to the customer, but it gives us more options. We're not very limited in terms of who that target market is. So we looked at the extent of integration. You can have full integration, so vertical integration, you own your supply chain. We looked at information sharing, how much information sharing will you do? And as we look at that information sharing, those relationships, and maybe the ownership of the supply chain, you have to decide where you're going to hold your inventory. Further down the supply chain, less flexibility of use, more value. If we can pool the risk by having our excess inventory, our safety stock in a central location, then we're more likely to be able to move that inventory, increase that turnover rate. Okay, and if we can delay the differentiation as well, then we're more likely to move that inventory as well.